Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. This is the second of two episodes that I'm recording back to back to make up for the recent hiatus that I've had. I haven't recorded an episode for a while because I was trying to get my MA assignment finished. And this assignment was about a dilemma. I've mentioned it on the podcast before, and I'll return to it at the end of this episode. Before then, however, I'd like to discuss several other dilemmas. So, a dilemma is a situation in which someone must choose between two equally unwelcome courses of action. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. And these sorts of situations, these dilemmas, are really good at getting you thinking. I found this with students, in fact. When two beliefs or values or ideas seem to come into conflict with one another, as they do in dilemmas, I think that we have a natural urge to try and resolve the inconsistency. And so it gets us thinking hard. There was a nice example recently in an RSHE lesson. It was in a module on societal flourishing, and we were looking at, in one lesson we'd looked at some of the challenges that face our society at large. And then in the second lesson, we were looking at some of the challenges that face our local community in particular. And we discussed lots of things. In particular, we discussed poverty and homelessness. And so we got onto the topic of whether you should give money to someone who asks you for it in the street. So someone comes up to you and asks you for some change. They say they haven't eaten for a long time. They want to buy some food, and indeed they look like they haven't eaten in a long time. So should you give them money? This provoked a bit of discussion. But then I threw in the plot twist. I said to my students, okay, suppose in this scenario that you also had reason to believe that this person was a drug addict. And though they were saying that they wanted to have some money to spend on food, they would perhaps spend it instead on drugs, which would further their drug habit, it would harm them, and it would contribute to the local illegal drugs trade. So what should you do in that situation? And this was the point at which students really sat up and started thinking, because this now was a dilemma. There was no straightforward answer. What should you do? And there were some wonderful suggestions. One suggestion was you should go and buy the food and give the food to the person. Another suggestion was that you should instead give the money to an organisation, perhaps a charity, who can help support this person. But I think the point I want to make here is that the conversation was interesting, but a little bit flat. It was only when we introduced this conflict, this dilemma, that students really sat up, started to engage more deeply and have more meaningful conversations. So dilemmas are a great way to get students thinking, to get students learning. And teaching is heavy with dilemmas. So that was a dilemma for the students. A bit of an illustration. However, teaching as a profession is heavy and thick with dilemmas. Not all of them are noticed, yet they all take a toll emotionally, I would say. They all contribute to the stress of the profession. But every so often one will kind of bubble up to the level of conscious awareness, and you're like, okay, this is a tricky situation, what we're going to do here. And so I wanted to share a couple of teacher-oriented dilemmas with you. And then I'll speak in particular about the one that I wrote about in my recent essay at the end. So the first one concerns trainee teachers in particular. So suppose a trainee has gotten into the habit of asking you, a more experienced teacher, to share your resources with them, to share your lesson plans with them. You are fully aware that workload is the number one killer of teachers. And so you want to help alleviate this trainee's workload. You want to help them with their lesson planning. So you feel inclined to share your resources with them. And indeed, this is what you do. But like I said, it's now become habituated. And the trainee continues to ask you for resources. You're also aware, however, that an important part of learning how to think like a teacher involves learning how to plan lessons. It's only when you plan lessons that you really try to put yourself inside your students' heads, think about what they need, think about what they currently know, where they need to get and how you're going to bridge the gap. You only do this when you plan lessons, when you think hard about planning lessons. And so by providing lessons, providing resources to this trainee, you're perhaps robbing them of the opportunity to do all this hard thinking, which is ultimately what matters when it comes to learning how to be a teacher. So what do? It's a dilemma. Do you share resources in order to reduce workload and to hopefully improve the chances that this trainee will stay in teaching? But if you do that, you rob them of the opportunity to think hard about planning. So perhaps you instead shouldn't share your resources. But that would only increase the trainee's workload and perhaps make them more likely to have some sort of burnout. So it's a dilemma. Don't know what to do. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that one. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on all the dilemmas I discuss in this episode. It's really only the last one that I discussed in my essay, which I think I have an answer to. But there's one more I'd like to discuss before then. It's the exclusion dilemma, or the ejection dilemma. So, suppose you're teaching a lesson, and there's a student in that lesson who is being especially disruptive. I think that this dilemma applies in particular to maths, because in maths, one lesson tends to build on the previous lesson. So if you miss one lesson, then the next lesson becomes more difficult, and this will have a cumulative effect over time, where all of a sudden the student is sat in a lesson and has no idea whatsoever you're talking about. And it's just because they've spent too much time out of lessons. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, way too far ahead of myself. So we got this situation. It's a lesson. Perhaps in particular, it's a maths lesson. And a student is being very disruptive. Disruptive to the point where it would warrant kicking them out of the lesson. So the dilemma is, do you kick them out? It might be the right thing to do in the moment. It would save the lesson. But by kicking the student out, they're going to lose even more learning. It's going to make the subsequent lesson even more difficult for them. It's going to have a cumulative effect over time. They're going to become worse and worse at maths. And I think we all know that poor behaviour and poor ability seem to go hand in hand. So as this student gets worse at maths, they only become more disruptive. And all of a sudden you've got into this habit of kicking them out. And so what do you do in the moment? Do you kick the student out and try and salvage the lesson? Or do you try to keep them in the lesson in the hope that even if they're being disruptive, they'll have a better chance of learning something by staying in the room than they would if you kick them out? And if they learn something, that will make the next lesson less confusing for them, and therefore make them less likely to play up in the next lesson. Whereas if you kick them out, the next lesson may be completely lost on them, and you're fighting to try and catch up, and they're continuing to be disruptive because they don't know what's going on. So, yeah, I call that the ejection dilemma. And this seems to be a dilemma in which the present seems to come into conflict with the future. So the right thing to do in the moment would be to kick the student out. However, where does that lead? it leads to a situation in which you might have to kick them out far more often. And all of a sudden they're not getting an education in your lessons because they're not in them. So there you go, another dilemma. How would you resolve the ejection dilemma? Now, before I speak about the dilemma which I wrote about for my MA assignment, my usual Patreon plea. So this episode took around 2 hours to produce, and that's about average. I aim to produce 2 episodes a month, so that's about 4 or so hours a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you sign up on Patreon, you'll have exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. I'll leave a link in the show notes below. Thank you ever so much. Okay, now on at last to the dilemma which I wrote about in my MA assignment. The dilemma here concerns whether to reward students or not reward them. And I'll illustrate this with an example from my own practice as a teacher. So a reward program was introduced in Year 9. I'm a Year 9 tutor, where students could be nominated by staff, and on Fridays, these students, their names would be displayed in all tutor groups along with the reason for which they were nominated. And these students would be entered into a prize draw to attend a dessert party. So this is very much an extrinsic reward program. You know, do the right thing and you could end up going to a dessert party. You know, it's an external incentive. Now, after a while, a pattern seemed to emerge. The pattern was that students who were generally badly behaved seemed to be getting nominated far more often than other students, disproportionately so. And often they were being nominated not for explicitly good behaviour, but rather just non-bad behaviour. And this pattern was fostering resentment in some other students who are generally well behaved. They would complain that the reward program was unfair, and their complaint went something like this. It's unfair that these students should be rewarded for, these few fleeting instances of good behaviour when we behave well all the time without any reward or acknowledgement whatsoever. So there's your dilemma. There are some students, perhaps the students who are generally badly behaved, who seem to require external incentives in order to behave. Yet these sorts of strategies seem to create resentment in the students who are generally well behaved. And furthermore, it can make these students more focused on rewards themselves. So they go from doing the right thing because it's the right thing to doing the right thing because they want a reward. And indeed I found this. So some of these students who are generally well behaved became far more preoccupied with external rewards and incentives after the program was introduced. Whereas before, they were doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do. Now they wanted to be nominated for the dessert party. And after extended discussions with expert colleagues, this does seem to be one of the perennial problems of education. So how do you encourage and motivate students who are generally badly behaved without discouraging and demotivating students who are generally well behaved? There does seem to be a real trade-off here. And when I discuss this dilemma with leaders in my year group, they would explain that this new reward program was aimed at students who perhaps are generally badly behaved. And that's because it was an equity-based program. That means that it's aimed at the students who need it most. And the students who need this sort of thing most are those who struggle to behave. So it's aimed at them. That's why generally badly behaved students seem to be overrepresented among the nominations for these dessert parties. But that was almost by design, because it's an equity-based program. And I think that this is the source of the dilemma. So as I said before, this program seemed to create resentment in students who were generally well behaved, and they would complain that it was unfair. These students, I think, are operating with a conception of fairness where fairness is just about brute equality. Everyone should be treated the same. That's how they're thinking in terms of fairness. So they weren't rewarded for being on time for lessons, for example. Now, these students who have often been late for lessons are being rewarded for arriving on time, and that's unfair. If they themselves hadn't been rewarded, then these students shouldn't be rewarded either. So the students who were complaining about this reward program were operating with a very egalitarian sense of justice. It's all about equal treatment, treating everyone exactly the same. Whereas the teachers who introduced the program, the leaders in the year group, they were operating with a very different conception of fairness. Their conception was equity-based, where it's not about treating everyone the same, but rather about treating each student according to their needs. And some students need rewards in order to behave properly. So that might be the source of the dilemma, but it doesn't really help us resolve it. Well, it kind of does. So, like I said, students are operating with a conception of fairness where it's all about treating everyone exactly the same. However, justice or fairness is educable. By that, I mean you can change the way someone thinks about justice or fairness. And so that's what I tried to do. When a student complained to me about how this reward program was unfair, I'd said, so I've had several of these conversations now, and a script has begun to crystallize. So I'll just kind of tell you how these conversations usually go. The student says it's unfair. I say, what do you mean? They say it's unfair that this student should be rewarded when I've always done the right thing, or we've always done the right thing, and we've never been rewarded. And I say, oh, okay, so you think that everyone should be treated exactly the same? They say yes. I say, okay, well, imagine a scenario in which you were responsible for dividing some food between two people. How much should they each get? And the student would usually say they should get half of the food each. Then I say, well, imagine now that one of those people has recently enjoyed an all-you-can-eat buffet. The other one, however, hasn't eaten in a week. Would you like to change your answer? And the student would typically say, yes, the starving person, the second one, they should receive more food. And this is the point at which I've got them. I say, oh, okay, so sometimes it's fair. The fair thing to do sometimes is to treat people differently according to their needs. And then at this point, the student will sometimes try to push back and say, yes, but that's different. And they'll try to explain how the imagined starving person isn't the same as this person who's just received a reward who they resent. But anyway, I think that by that point, the conversation has served its purpose, because it showed the student that thinking about fairness and justice in terms of brute equality, where everyone is treated the same all the time, that's a flawed conception of fairness. There are other conceptions, better conceptions of justice or fairness, where treating people differently according to their needs is in fact the fair or just thing to do. And so if I can encourage students to see that, then they would perhaps no longer think that this reward program is unfair. They'll start thinking more along the same lines as the teachers who introduced the reward program. And so if they don't perceive the reward program as unfair, then they'll be less likely to suffer those negative effects on motivation. So there you go, a potential resolution to the dilemma. It's highly speculative, by the way. So that was the hypothesis that I was busy formulating in my most recent MA assignment. This idea that you might be able to protect well-behaved students' motivation by helping them see justice in a different way. Yes, it's a speculative hypothesis. Hopefully one day I might actually test it to see whether it works. But at least from a theoretical standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense. So there you go. Several dilemmas. Like I said, teaching is a profession that's heavy with dilemmas. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on these, especially the middle two, to which I didn't really have an answer. So the one where it was a decision between sharing or not sharing resources with a trainee teacher, and the second one where it was a decision between ejecting or not ejecting a naughty student. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we will talk again soon. Sooner than last time, I'm going to try to get back into a regular 2-weekly habit of producing a podcast episode. Talk soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.